So again, as I said earlier, the main goal of this presentation is not to make you say that like you should build this, you should build that every game, you should do this. And it's not really a tier list of items. Certain items are always going to be stronger than others, and they're going to have to be like adjusted. It's more, again, a way of thinking how to do stuff, how to think when you're building, thinking before you're building, and then coming to the conclusion which build you want to go for. So again, I don't want to tell you what to build. I just want to give you the tools to figure it out on your own, so when you don't have someone that knows what to build next to you. So a very common term I'm going to be using will be the Kane theorem. It's a way of thinking that I've had success with explaining build thought process in the past, and it's what I'm using when I'm thinking about what to build. And another thing that's very important when you want to know what to build is you need to understand what the items do, like what they fulfill, like what purpose they fulfill, and then also what your champion needs. So like if your champion needs specific stats and your item doesn't give you that, then you shouldn't be building it. So as Lostfish said earlier, for example, Rabadons and Caitlyn is not really going to give you any stats that you desire, right? So, but that's obviously a very common knowledge thing here, I would say. I don't think anyone here is building Rabadons on Caitlyn. Anyway, so the Kane theorem is a way of thinking when building. So you have different items along the color spectrum between blue and red. So a blue item is an item that mostly categorizes in high burst damage, not that good in sustained fights, very good in short fights and bursty fights, and it loses value over time and into tankier opponents. The red Kane, again, is more of like the Rost, is doing good consistent damage, has good sustainability, good over longer fights, and the longer the fights go on, the higher the value of the items get. So the colors have nothing to do with the color of the item, more of an easier thought process of, let's say that blue and red Kane are equally strong. Which item would you build on blue or red Kane? Anyway, let's continue. So again, a blue build does not mean the color of the item. You have some examples here in Galeforce, Duskblade, Night Harvester, and Shurelias. And the thing they have in common is they're all good in shorter fights rather than longer fights. So the blue build again is more for burstier fights, squishier opponents. And by building this, you obviously give up things like being able to fight longer in team fights, being able to kill tanks, and being able to sustain, right? Like you won't be able to fight for longer if you get chunked out. But what you do get is you get better burst when you do get on the enemy squishies, right? So let's say you're playing something like a Fizz, for example, but you have Liandry's, then maybe you won't have the damage necessary to kill the Xerath before he gets away. Meanwhile, if you have something like Night Harvester, you might have just enough burst to kill him and then get out with the extra movement speed that it gives. Again, if you have any questions or I'm unclear with anything, just feel free to ask. So, some examples of a red build. We have Kraken, Eclipse, Liandry's, and Moonstone, not Moonstone. And what they all have in common is they're very good if fights go longer, because let's say Liandry's has a burn effect that if it gets reapplied, you do more damage over time. It's max health damage. It's very good into more tankier opponents rather than squishies. A thing that I do want to mention is as well, there's no black and white, so there's no blue and red completely. All items have some sort of characteristics of both. So sometimes you would even build Kraken Slayer on an ADC where you would normally try to opt more for a bursty build. It all really depends on champion synergy, and other factors that you have to take into consideration. This just gives you the very basic fundamentals on how to think about building. So Moonstone, again, gives you a lot of value the longer the fights go on. You'll heal more, you'll keep your team in the fight for longer, and it gives you a lot more value than just a little bit of burst movement speed at the start. So what do you give up in this case, right? It just seems like it's all good. Like you have damage, you have everything. Sometimes fights don't take that long. Maybe you only get off like 6 auto attacks in total. Then maybe it would have been better having a Gale Force to like dodge a crucial skill shot. And again, that's something you're gonna have to like also learn through experience. Sometimes a champion might look like a very tanky opponent, but turns out they're rather squishy. Or the other way around. Like one example that I can think of right now would be Ezreal. You would think he's rather squishy, but most Ezreal builds, at least in the past, had something like a Divine Sunderer and then maybe even tank items like Frozen Heart, which would make him a very tanky opponent in the end. So now we have the third class of items. There's probably more if you really want to dig deeper into it, but I didn't really know what to call it, but I've decided on tech items. You could call them situational items or even champion specific items. These are the items that don't really qualify as one or the other and are going to be built because you want something from the item. In the previous ones, you wanted either burst damage or consistent damage or sustain. Here it's more like, oh shit, the enemy has a Rengar, a Zed, a Karthus, maybe I should get a Zhonya's. So some examples of these items is, as I said, Hourglass, which is really good versus targeted burst, meaning burst that you can anticipate but not really do anything about. So like a Syndra ultimate, a Zed ultimate, a Karthus ultimate, you can't really dodge those, but you can prevent the damage when having Zhonya's. Shield Bow, just general burst and survivability. Everfrost, either when you need some to keep engagers off of you, like you need some CC to keep them off of you, or if you need some engage yourself, like some CC engage like Kazz needs it, or something like Sylas where he needs to land his secondary E. So he uses Everfrost to make sure they're stunned, or rather snared, to hit his important skill shots to make sure he can put his damage away. So if you do have some items where you're like a little bit confused where you would build them, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think. And then you can like ask if you have any item in mind where you would be like, I don't really know when I would build this. If you think it is a tech item, that is. Also, if you don't want to like unmute, you can always put it in the item discussion.
Do items like, let's say, Frozen Heart, fall into tech items if they're used on a role that they're not originally intended for?
So what I realized when making this is, you bring up a very valid point, is that most tank items fall under the condition over tech items. Because again, when you're a tank, you're looking at the enemy team, right? And you're saying, okay, that's 3 AD, 2 AP. Well, I guess I'll need a couple of armor items and maybe a magic resist item or two. So let's say you have Frozen Heart. In this case, it's a tech item versus attack speed. Meanwhile, Randuin's Omen would be the tech item versus crit. Very good question. Confirm, tanks are the most advanced role. They only build high tech. Yeah, again, I didn't really have any other place to put most tank items because I wouldn't consider them. Most of them aren't really bursty or sustainy. It's more like you look what the enemy have and then you itemize accordingly. Okay, well, I will continue, but if you have any questions or you want to go back, just let me know and we'll go back a couple of steps. So now I'm going to start with like some examples for top lane. And again, before I start, I'm just going to quickly go through the Kane theorem again, just so that there's no confusion. So red items, consistent damage, anti-tank, sustainy type items, and blue items, very bursty, shorter fights. And then obviously we have the situational / tech items. I didn't change it on this page. Also, some of these placements can be argued. I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh yeah, this is the 100% correct tier list for this, and if you disagree, you're wrong. No, that's not what I'm saying. This is just the general one that I made for top lane. Obviously, there are some items missing. You could put most of these into situational items, and you could put some of these under blue. It's really just depends on how you view things, right? So let's just go through some. So why is Bork in the red tier section? Well, it has max health damage, has life steal, has attack speed, has all stats that you really like want for an extended fight. Meanwhile, if you have Stride Breaker, you're looking more for shorter trades, kite back with the active, and then re-engage. Again, if there's any of these placements you're confused about or you want to ask for, go ahead.
Where is Radiant Virtue?
Where is Radiant Virtue on this? I would put it under situational items.
And even Shroud.
Spirit's Virtue would be red or build a support. Are you talking about Spirit Visa? Okay, Radiant Virtue. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so Radiant Virtue, I would say, is definitely under situational items. So examples where you would build that would be on mostly tanks, I presume, is what you're asking for. And then let's say you have Ornn, Malphite, or Shen. I think those would be.
Even on Riven, because her Gore Drinker is so bad at this point with Riven players.
I mean, I can see that, but
even with even Shroud, like I coached one guy and he's having success with this too.
I mean, I believe you, but yeah. So in this case, the most common users would probably be the three I mentioned, which would be Ornn, Malphite, Shen, and you would build it if you have good carries. If you have a team, for example, with a Master Yi jungle, a Kog'Maw support with a Lulu, and like a Yone mid lane or something. Obviously, you don't need all of them, but like maybe one or two very good carries, then maybe you should consider not building your Jack-Show or Heartsteel, because you're not going to be the one carrying the team with damage or tankiness. You're just going to make sure that your carries are alive for long enough, have the extra cooldown that Radiant Virtue provides to carry the game. Obviously, if they're performing really badly, maybe we go back to Jack-Show or Heartsteel in that case and try to carry it ourselves. But it's their job to carry when they pick the Master Yi, the Kog'Maw, the Yone. Like, all they provide is damage, so all you need to do is let them get to the damage.
Yeah, I have a question on what you just said. What if you're in the split and they have a Jax? Are you just gonna perma team fight, or you're just not gonna do anything in the split lane? If they have a Fiora Jax, you will lose the trade, right? If you just go these items.
Okay,
Yeah?
I'm assuming you're playing Shen, right? And you're playing versus a split pusher, right? That's what you were asking?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay,
With the
so
items you said, because you wanna. Oh, sorry.
yeah,
You want
that's
me
okay.
to reiterate? All right.
Okay, I'll try to interpret it and I'll try to answer it. If I'm like floating off to the wrong place, let me know. But what I'm trying to see is like you have to assess whether or not your team wins with or without you, and you have to assess whether or not you can hold the split pusher to begin with. Because let's say you're playing versus a very fed Fiora and you're playing Shen, and she can just ignore you and or maybe even dive you at some point because Fiora is a very balanced champion at the moment. Then maybe you just gotta have to take either you try to ping your team over and you like collapse 3-4 people onto the Fiora, and then you try to make a play on the other side of the map, like try to get those objectives, try to get the Baron recalls, so maybe you can go ahead and ult and then maybe finish the fight as quickly as possible, insta recall, go back to defending the Fiora. It really just depends on how strong the person is that you're holding and whether or not you can do it by yourself and whether or not your team wins without you. If your team wins without you and you can hold them, well, just sit on the sideline and hold the person. Like build anathemas chains, put it on them, and just sit there and relax while your team wins you the game. The issue you're gonna have is when that's not the case. When you're the solo carry, you're the Shen that's like Giga fed. You can hold the Fiora, but you need to be the one holding her because you're the only one that's strong enough to hold her, and your team loses the fight. So what you would have to do in that case would be you'd have to try to push out to buy time, then ult down or TP down if you're not Shen. Try to finish the fight, get the objective, then go back to try to hold it by the time that you bought, pushing out the wave where they are eventually split pushing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that
Sorry,
does
I-
make sense. I'm sorry. Oh no, you can continue.
Yeah, I was asking like I just came inside. I actually don't know like what are these color codes for the items?
Wait, come again?
I just came into the classroom just
Oh.
then, so like what's the categorization for like these?
Oh,
like,
okay,
items?
yeah, I can redo it. So again, we were talking previously about the term that I call the Kane theorem, which is like how I've categorized items in a very simple manner, so you would like be able to identify items yourself and then be able to like know what to build depending on what team comp you're into. So you have blue items, which are more towards like quote unquote catered towards blue Kane in this case, which like very bursty, low sustain, but like for very quick fights. And then you have red build, which is the opposite, right? Like you want to have sustain, high damage, and like let's say Moonstone, for example, is a good example in this case, where like the longer the fight goes on, the more value your Moonstone gets. Meanwhile, your Shurelias is not really going to increase in value if the fight goes on for 10 seconds or 35 seconds.
Yeah.
So in this case, we have red items for top lane here, which would be like the ones that give you good value versus bruisers and tanks and so on. And you have the blue items. Again, you can argue with me about these placements. They're not 100% correct. There's not always a completely blue or completely red item. And some items are going to change depending on really what champions there are or what champions you're playing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
No worries. Thank you for the question. Anyways, unless we have any more question about top lane, I'm going to continue with jungle. One of our jungle coaches, Vimaris, was supposed to be here and help out, but he's probably sleeping because it's very late. So I'll try to do my best of still keeping up with the jungle items. Obviously, it's a little bit harder for me to get all of the jungle items in here. I think the main thing that is important to have here is obviously the smites, because you need to know when to take what smite. And let me just quickly explain what the smites do in their full out forms so that you get a little bit of an understanding why I've put two of them in the red items tier and one of them in the blue items tier. So I put the Moss Stomper and the red one. I don't know what the other ones are called. I just know that the green one is Moss Stomper. So I put the green and the red one in the red items because the champions, they usually take... no worries, I wake up tomorrow. That's fun. The champions, they usually take red and green. Either want to have... I guess I could probably put red under the blue items now that I think about it, but champions that really take green are usually the ones that already have a very high damage and already excel at buying other quote-unquote red items. And so all they need is to stay alive for a couple seconds longer to get some extra value from their kits and their items. Meanwhile, the red, I guess the reason why I put red here is because it has max health damage, meaning which is good against tanks. Meanwhile, the blue one is more obviously blue because it doesn't really give you any extra damage, it just gives you movement speed, which I guess would have put it under tech items because it makes it so you're on the map more and can do more depending on what you're playing into. Let's say you're playing Rengar you obviously need some movement speed in bushes, so you get some extra value from your champion's kit. So I'm just gonna drink something. My throat was a little bit dry. Excuse me. So what I was saying, that blue is more of like higher tempo, which is, I guess, now that we look at it, a little bit of the theme where red builds usually are better when you get to very late game, because champions get very high resistances after the durability patch now. Like, they scale very well into late game. Meanwhile, blue items excel at obviously bursting, which is harder when more resistances in the game. Let's just look at some items here, and then I'll try to explain why they're in there. I think Liandry's we already talked about earlier, but max health damage and very consistent damage. Gotta stay hydrated. If you don't have any water, people gotta get something to drink. Staying hydrated is the best item tech.
Shouldn't Eclipse be a blue item since it deals a chunk of burst damage up front?
Well, I think you could argue for it to be in blue items. The reason why I didn't want to put it in blue items is because I already had Prowler's Claw and Duskblade there, meaning that among the lethality items, it's the red version of it. Meaning once you want the like really high burst, you would take Prowler's or Duskblade. But if you want a little bit more, because it gives you armor penetration per mythic item as well, so it gives you that little bit of extra oomph versus tanks. Obviously, it's not going to be better than a Kraken Slayer on most champions that have attack speed. And it's also most of the time not going to outvalue Riftmaker or Liandry's. But I do still believe that it does belong in the red item list. If I made a purple item list, like ones that are like in between, I would probably put Eclipse there. But again, that's why I'm saying like these aren't like cut in stone. Some of these can be moved up or down. Most of them can be put in at least 2 categories, maybe 3. But I would say that they're mostly put in the correct positions. So for some tech items, I did put Hard Steel, Everfrost, Crown. They are very similar items, Crown and Everfrost, but you would build Crown versus more heavy burst. So like it's very similar to Shield Bow in the sense that once the enemies have very burst and don't have that much poke that they can just like remove it from you, then you would get a lot of value from it. Meanwhile, if they only have a lot of engage and maybe some poke, maybe you would lean more towards Everfrost, because Crown is like always going to get poked off of you, and then at least with Everfrost you can reposition yourself with the active because you're slowing and CCing the enemies. But yeah, other than that, I don't really have that much more to say about jungle. Again, I was planning on having Vamaris talk a little bit more extensively about jungle items here. But I'll talk more about the AP items once we get to mid lane here, because I feel like that's more appropriate than taking them on the jungle session. If you have any questions about the jungle session, feel free to ask them now, otherwise I'll be
So
going
what's the rationale
down.
behind putting Yomu's in red?
Well, my argument was
Why'd you
between
put the red
putting in...
item?
I
Oh,
don't know why I put Yomu's there, I'm gonna be completely honest. Maybe I did it to make sure that you guys aren't sleeping and actually see that it's a big mistake having Yomu's there. Yeah, no, Yomu's probably shouldn't be there.
Right.
But yeah, thank you for pointing it out. So, everyone's favorite Yasuo lane. So we come to mid lane now. Again, a lot of items, if we go back again, are going to be very similar. So we have Liandry's Riftmaker all there. So the main thing I want to talk about here again, well, I'll just recap the Kayn theorem once again, just in case someone did miss it and is confused. Even though I would say that that's pretty much impossible at this point. Red items, more for high resistance, more for longer fights, better versus tankier opponents. blue items, shorter fights, squishier opponents. Just think of it like that. Obviously, there is room for arguing, and depending on how tanky they are, you would opt more towards blue items or red items. And also, let's say you're playing versus 4 bruisers and a Jinx, but you're playing the AP Malphite, then maybe you would still go full normal, like raw damage with Rabadons, Ludens, and Shadow Flame, because your job is still to kill the squishy target rather than the tankier targets. So really just try to figure out, again, as I said earlier, what is your job? What do you need to, like, what items do you need to finish the job that you're supposed to do? And some champions obviously need more items and more gold than others to fulfill their purpose. So like an example of that would be Anivia, for example. So Anivia doesn't really need that many items to do the same job that she would have done with 3,000 more gold. Meanwhile, something like a Yone or a Jinx with 2 items is going to be significantly less impactful than a Jinx with 3 items. Anyways, so again, we have some tech items that I want to talk about, mainly actually the first one here, which got reworked this patch. So it works very similarly to Sterak's Gauge, to Malvma Mordius, where if you fall below 30% HP, you get a shield based on your current mana, I'm pretty sure. I think it's 20% current mana. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And so it's become more of an item for champions that really want mana, but also want a little bit more of a defensive option. Everfrost, I already talked about. Crown, I already talked about. Zhonya's, I talked about earlier, but I can repeat it. Mostly targeted burst is when you would build Zhonya's. Also, a thing to mention about Zhonya's is, though, that there's champions that have very specific interactions with Zhonya's. So when we're on the topic of Anivia, for example, Anivia can like walk into an entire enemy team, press ult on herself and then Zhonya's, and ult will still stay up for the duration of the Zhonya's. Meanwhile, champions like Ryze, they removed that interaction because it was too strong. It was too strong to just be able to ult Zhonya's and then just get a free ride out. And then we have items that you would build if you feel like you need more CDR and movement speed, which is Cosmic Drive. Items that only work on certain champions are also considered tech items, which is, for example, Horizon Focus is only going to work on champions that have consistent CC or consistent... Yeah, the shield is back. A consistent poke or consistent CC, right? Otherwise, you will not going to get the value from the item. Personally, I think Horizon Focus is rather weak, so I would still try to stay away from the item. But yeah, I don't think there's really that much more to say. Again, it's very repetitive because most of the items we've already seen and we already know what the difference is. So again, like I can take a very specific example of when you would decide between a red item and a blue item. So let's say you're playing Victor. You've finished your first item. Let's say it's a Luden's Echo, and you're pressing tab. The normal team comp you're playing into is 3 squishies, 2 a little bit more bruisery type champions. But you realize that their ADC, which is a Caitlyn in this case, started building Hex Drinker second item, and the enemy support's also building a Mar for some reason. And they're just all building a shit ton of MR out of nowhere. Normally you'd be like, oh yeah, but Shadow Flame and Rabadons should be my next items. But because they've built more towards the red items, like they've built more towards sustaining through fights and fighting longer, building the counter, I guess, to what they're building would be the best course of action in that case. Obviously, I do not have the math between Shadow Flame and Void Staff in my head, I think somebody probably has that sheet somewhere where it like gives you the difference between MR points where you would get more value from getting just raw AP rather than getting the percentage magic resist penetration that Void Stuff provides. Also, I did put Sork boots here, and I would have put cooldown boots in the blue items, but I couldn't find the icon for it. So again, Sork boots more for... I guess Sork boots could have also been put in blue items now that I think about it. But I feel like it's better for versus tanks. Meanwhile, CDR boots is you get to throw your abilities out at them a little bit more. Again, I think you could argue them for both, but anyways, we already talked a little bit about ADC, but I'll just go over it again and give you my thoughts upon why I've placed items where I've placed them. So again, red items, pretty self-explanatory, mostly tankier items here. I could have probably put Bloodthirster up here as well, because again, it's very good in longer fights. But the reason why I put Bloodthirster in tech items is I think it's a very good tech versus burst champions because of the shield that you're getting, and also versus heavy poke comps, where if you get hit by a skill shot and you get half HP'd, no worries, hit the wave a couple times and you're back to full HP. Meanwhile, if you would build something like Kraken Slayer PD, then you would not really have that much sustain, so if you get hit by some poke, you'd be kind of out of the out of the game, or out of the fight at least, so you'd have to probably recall. We do have a question here. When would you build Rod of Ages? Since they just like really buffed it, I can't really give you the power level of Rod of Ages right now, but I would say if your champion really, like, that's why it's under tech items in my opinion, if your champion really wants mana, HP, and level to scale, like again, we have Kassadin, we have Ryze, we have Cassiopeia, all of these champions, they want to just have a lot of mana because they either have spammy abilities or their abilities stack up in mana. You would need that extra bit of mana, and I'm pretty sure the the passive of dealing damage gives you back mana is still on Rod of Ages. I know it's on the Catalyst, but you gain back mana from dealing damage, or is it the other way around, that you gain HP from dealing damage? Either way, it's something like that it's either you deal damage and get mana, or you waste mana, get HP. Yes, something like that. So you spend mana and you get something. That's the gist of it. You spend mana and you get something. So if you can spend a lot of mana, you would get more. If that makes any sense. Obviously, that was a little bit... It could have been a little bit of misinformation there because I'm not 100% sure on the exact wording of that item. But I hope that gave you at least a little bit of an answer that you sought out. Oh. So yeah, so we went through the red items. Now for the blue items, Gale Force, pretty self-explanatory, very bursty, could be put under tech items as well if you want to use it as like your champion doesn't really have any dash and you really need to be able to dodge specific skill shots. Maybe you would still opt into a build like Gale Force Lordams, or maybe Gale Force Bork. I don't know which champion would build that. Maybe Ashe would do that in very specific clips. Again, you're gonna have to like experiment with this yourself. I did put Collector here, and I will say that I personally think the item is very bad, but I do see that the opportunities where you would build it can be very obvious, if that makes sense. So I would build the item if there's, let's say, 3 or 4, I would say at least 4 enemy very squishy champions that do not have that much armor, and I need the crit to get like an IE or Navoris as a third item. So I would build something like maybe Collector or Kraken into Collector second. Did I just say Collector twice? I think Gale Force or Kraken first, Collector second, and then like IE or Navoris third. It's very rare, but sometimes I do build Collector, but I do feel that most champions can make better use of Rapid Fire because I feel like they have very similar uses of like you're playing into squishies, meaning they're most likely range, so you need the extra range to be able to deal with them. Other tech items, again, maybe I shouldn't have put Triforce here. I should have probably talked a little bit more about Triforce in the top lane. I'm jumping a little bit here. As an item where you would build it if you really need to split push to win the game. If you feel like, oh, you would definitely lose because you're playing versus an Ornn or a Malphite that's going to outperform you in team fights. So maybe just getting that extra bit of tower taking potential is going to enable you to do better. Otherwise, I could have put it under blue items, but I didn't really feel like it gives you a lot of value in extended fights, so I didn't feel like it would fit under the blue items category. But I just thought I'd mention it real quick. One last thing before I go over to support is, I should have probably talked about this earlier, is there's certain items that are very strong in different metas, meaning that their power level is so high that you would sometimes have to compromise your normal build in order to fit in the item. In this case, I'm talking about Ravenous Hydra being very strong. Obviously on ADCs, some of them do very much need crit above anything else. Like one example of that would be Caitlyn. I feel like Caitlyn always needs to get at least 60% crit, if not more, at all costs, meaning that even if an item is that ridiculously strong, what your champion needs is most of the time going to be the way to go. But yeah, sometimes I've seen a lot of Jins recently build Ravenous, which again, out of a purely thinking standpoint, it doesn't make too much sense. If you want like Omnivamp, you can just go Eclipse. But I guess if you want both, you can get Ravenous as well. We talked about Stormrazor a little bit earlier. I think, again, it did make a comeback. I don't know where or why it made a comeback. I think it's always been a decent item, but it's a very situational item where you need to make use of the slow. And the issue that I see with it, it's very expensive because the item right next to it, Phantom Dancer, gives you similar value for cheaper, and it gives you more attack speed. In order to, like, I think you lose a little bit of like on-hit damage from the passive that Stormrazor has, and you also lose a little bit of AD, but you get a lot of movement speed, which is a very crucial stat for ADCs, because again, you need to be keeping your distance and output your damage from afar. I mean, if you can move faster, like Lostfish mentioned earlier, you can sometimes deal damage when you shouldn't be able to, like a Misfortune versus the Caitlyn. And I didn't put Maw of Malmortius here, which I probably should have. When you're playing versus very high AP threats, burst threats that is, I would build Maw. If the AP damage is more slow and consistent, I would probably build Wit's End instead. Anyway, that's all I have about the bot lane itemization. Now, coming for the support itemization, I am not as confident, and because they did do some like support item rework recently, and I haven't played enough support to test out all of the items. So, Henry, if you do have something you want to like chime in, feel free. Otherwise, I'll just, for the last time for this presentation, go over again really quickly the Kane theorem one last time. But before I do, I will hydrate really quickly once again. Okay, so red items are for extended fights versus tankier opponents. Blue items, shorter fights, burstier items. And as for support and tanks, most items are tech and situational items. No shocker there. Supports need to have something difficult, at least let it be itemization. So in the red tier, the only reason why I have Locket of the Iron Solari in red tier and not in tech is because of the passive that it gives per mythic. It gives your team resistances based on how many mythics you have. And I'm not sure if it also stacks up the more people are around you, but I just know that it gives you resistances. And resistances are better in longer fights. Obviously, resistance can also be better in short fights, meaning I could have put it under blue items as well. But I feel like if you can provide your team with resistance for a longer extended period of time, that's the reason why I did put it under red items. We do have I think it's the upgraded version of Relic Shield here on red items, because again, it makes you a little bit tankier, meaning you'll be fighting longer. And under blue items, you deal more damage, have more mana, but you're going to be squishier. That's a little bit of a trade-off. Otherwise, we have Moonstone, pretty self-explanatory. The longer the fight goes on, the more you heal, the more value you get, the happier the Moonstone user is. Imperial Mandate, it's a very tricky item. I was going to put it under tech items, because again, I feel like it's gated by you can't really buff it, because if you buff it, champions like Nami become out of control. But nerfing it doesn't really accomplish anything, because that's basically direct nerfing Nami as well, because she's one of the few champions that do buy this item. But I do feel like it belongs under this tier, because it gives movement speed for the person that procs the, what do you call it, the mark, I guess, after the champion has been tagged. Legit Nami item, nobody else buys it. So like I would say that 95 to 99% of usage of this item is from Nami. The other 1% is like Renata, an occasional Lux, and something like that. Again, which makes it more of a tech item. But the reason why I want to talk about it is I think it's a very underrated item. And I think not enough people take advantage of it when it should be used. And I think it should be used into squishier teams. Oh, I did forget about Maokai, you're right. I'm thinking Maokai being more of a jungler than a support nowadays, or a top laner. If my Lulu buys Mandate, I'm going AFK. Fair. Ashe, another good user. Forgot about that. Shouldn't shoulder guards be a red item as well? I think shoulder guard is under the red item tier. Again, I didn't put all of the 4 support items there, but or are you thinking about a different item? Because I'm pretty sure shoulder guard is the thing, the support item. Anyways, let's just quickly go over the tech items, and then I'll just ask Enver if he has anything he wants to add at the end. So, again, pretty self-explanatory on the first one. Mikhail's gives your team a QSS. When would you build it? When enemies have a lot of CC, that is like, you need to get rid of it from your ADC. That's Val, pretty similar. Enemy has a lot of burst towards your ADC, or your carry, which doesn't always have to be your ADC, but in this case, we're going to have to say ADC so that the disgruntled ADC mains in this chat don't get mad at me. And then anti-heal, pretty self-explanatory. The reason why I put Morelos here is I feel like it's more egoistic and more burst damage oriented. Meanwhile, this is more tech and support and champion dependent. Ardent Sensor, it's champion dependent. You need if you're personally attacked by that statement. I don't know what you mean by that. Ardent Sensor, it depends on you having an ADC with a lot of attack speed and on hit. So again, it's a very situational item, but when it works wonders. Abyssal Mask, when you're versus a lot of AP and you have, I'm pretty sure it gives you it removes enemy MR as well. Quick tip for current meta. Don't buy Ardent, it's really bad, it doesn't give enough damage. Heard, coming from a Kog'Maw player that loves having his Lulus. Understandable. So yeah, again, I'm just saying where the items are. I have not put them in a tier list. Some of these items are better than others. In a perfect world where everything would be perfectly balanced, you could just look at a team and be like, yep, 3 tanks, Moonstone game. Yep, 3 squishies, Shrelia's game. That's not how it works. Items are going to be stronger and weaker, so depending on how weak, let's say, Moonstone is, maybe you wouldn't even run Moonstone into 4 tanks because it's that weak at the moment that you would rather just have either Mandate or Locket of the Iron Solari. Anyways, now for the last couple of items. If there's an enemy that you need to CC for longer or does an absurd amount of damage to you, Anathema's Chains. If you need to take care of one target and you have CC, then you have Even Shroud because it gives you that extra bit of burst. Also, a fun synergy with Even Shroud is if you have champions like Katarina, Viego, Master Yi that need resets, just having that extra percentage damage towards the target that you CC can go a long way of you winning the whole fight because they can get their resets and pop off. Anti-shield item, anti-ward item, roaming item, very situational. I should have put Swifties here as well, I couldn't find it though. Because Swifties would be the anti-slow boots item, that's also like a budget Moby boots. Literally because it's cheaper. Imagine building Moonstone and step Shrelias on Rakan, kick W. I mean, I could see a meta where you could build that, even though it wouldn't be too good on Rakan specifically, because I feel like Moonstone requires you to have a little bit more healing and shielding. I could definitely see it working. And then the last 2 items, anti-attack speed, anti-crit, as we said earlier. Again, if you have any question about anything item related, now would be the time. Otherwise, I'll ask Enver if he has anything to say. And then I'm gonna have to call it a day. I have recorded it, I hope. Please tell me. Okay, it's recording good. Otherwise, I would be crying. So yeah, Enver, do you have anything you want to add here? Mr. Illuminate?
But like that's a no.
Yeah, I think that is indeed a no. Well, if there's anything you want to ask about any item, whether or not I've talked about it today or not, again, now's the time. I give you some time to think about it.
Wouldn't you consider rapid fire cannon to be kind of a tech item rather than just a red item?
I have it as under blue items, but yeah, I definitely think it is a tech item, yes.
It's currently, it feels like it's mostly used in memes builds by like Echo. I know that Graves can use it pretty decently because it makes the shrapnel spread really tight. So you just get more burst damage that way. So it definitely feels more like a tech item since I don't see any AD carries actually playing with it.
Rapid fire cannon? Or did you say something else? Yeah, okay. So
RFC.
Yeah, so rapid fire cannon is a very specific item. That's why I think it could be. Yeah, exactly. It's a Caitlyn Jhin item. Almost hit the nail perfectly there. The champions that can use it really well because they need to outrange really far. Like it's when you feel like you literally cannot walk up. Yeah, not good on Kate, pretty much only good on Jhin. Yeah, and the reason why it's good on Jhin specifically is that you want to get the very high range damage to then do it, like hit him with a W so you can CC them yourself. Can be built on Jinx, but it's also situational. Kind of good on Son of Sport, yep. Like all the champions already have great range. Like the reason why Jinx likes it is she needs the assist to get her passive off. TF, good one, yeah. Twist of Fate is also one that needs to get the extended range to get the stun off. Is Navori more of a red item? So I had a conversation with, I don't know if he's here, no he's not, with Sky and Harry about the difference between IE and Navori. And I think we came to the conclusion that you need a specific amount of damage from your abilities to outperform IE in damage. So if I were to put one of those items in red items, it would probably be IE rather than Navori. But I can understand why you would want to have Navori and IE in the red item tier. Navori is more for movement, IE more for damage. Example, playing Kazz, if you need more damage, you go IE. If you need more movement, you go Navori. Same as Lucian. I think that's a pretty good statement. It's more of like, it's not really, I wouldn't really call it only movement. I would more say if you need your abilities to be off cooldown. Because, yeah, in those specific two champions that build it, they build it to get their their movement cooldowns quicker. But as was said right after right here, is that Xayah, example, doesn't really have a movement ability. So the movement argument doesn't really hold up for Xayah. I mean, she gets movement speed from her W, yes, but she doesn't have the same type of movement ability as Lucian and Kazz. It's very mild compared to those two. But yeah, I do understand that, yes, she does get movement speed from her W. And also her E damage is increased a lot by the Navori Quick Blades. She might be bird. She ain't flying like Lucian. So yeah, and where are you back now, or are you still not here? Okay, he's not here. Okay. Anyways, that's all I have for you right now. I'll see if I can get this uploaded somewhere. If I do, I'll let Enver let you know where it is. And thank you guys so much for sitting through me talking for almost an hour. And yeah, I'll stop recording in a couple seconds.